Welcome to New Mexico Black Rifle Operators Union. I'm your host, Sean. You know, nothing screams Americana more than the Single Action Army. That is the Colt Single Action Army. If you watched any John Wayne movie, you watched any of the older westerns, even the newer westerns, you've seen the Colt Single Action Army. Now, my Uncle Phil had two of these. They're beautiful pistols. Great guns. He had one that was what would be called a Wyatt Earp Special. So it had a longer barrel, like a 9-inch or a 10-inch barrel. It was very cool. The 45 Long Colt for its day, back in, the late 1800s, was the cartridge in the United States. It was in rifles, it was in pistols. Imagine being a pioneer, or in the West, where you are your only supply chain. So it didn't make sense to have a rifle and a pistol that had different ammunition. It was easier just to have one ammunition to run in both your rifle and your pistol. Now, if you only saw that you needed a rifle, more often than not, you'd go with something more powerful, and probably a different rifle. Specifically, you probably went with a Winchester Model 73 or 94, which are also iconic weapons and will be on this podcast at some point. I'm trying to get an example of one for my own collection. But back to the Single Action Army. The gun is currently available in a replica form. And what I mean by that is there are two companies I know of, Pieta and I want to say it's Cimarron. A lot of people will say it's Cameron or whatever, but it coming from the Southwest, Cimarron is what the name is. But Cowboy Action Shooting, which is like 3-gun for old-timey guns, right? So they use a double-barrel shotgun or a shotgun of any kind of the vintage of that era, a lever gun, and your pistol, your sidearm. So that's their three arms they use. So they would use a single-action army or a single-action pistol of some kind. Some of them are cap and ball. Some of them are modern cartridges, or metallic cartridges, I should say. But they're downloaded so that you can get more accuracy and hit probability, I guess, at some of these ranges. And you don't need a 357 velocity in a Cowboy Action match, if you've ever seen one. They're pretty close in, and it's more so for the show and then also the time. So, for the shooters, that is. So, what makes the Single Action Army so iconic isn't just because of its movie presence, it's because of its role in history. It was one of the first repeating arms that had a metallic cartridge case and was chambered in just about every pistol caliber that could be chambered in the gun. Understand they'd have to be rimmed cartridges so that you could fit into a traditional cylinder of a revolver. And the modern guys, you can get them down to 357. You can get 357 Magnum. You can get 44 Magnum. You can get 45 Long Colt, 38 Special, 38. There's several different 38 calibers that are black powder variants. 44 40s. You can get the real loads, or as close as you can, the modern day equivalents to the original loads that were used in these, if you're wanting to do cowboy action. But if you're interested, they make a great, range gun. They also make a great cowboy gun if you're actually out on the range herding cattle. They make excellent deer guns. When I say deer hunting, with a long enough barrel, you could hunt with a 357 Magnum for deer, I believe, in New Mexico. They changed some of that because ammunition's changed so much, but you could hunt with it. I wouldn't recommend hunting with a single action army because in its guise, as its default guise, I should say, is what it is. There is no place for optics or adjustable sights. Remember that the single action army was made back in the day where sighting systems were kind of rudimentary at best, but they were also not that super high tech and advanced because the machining processes were just being invented for these things. So there was, on the single action army, there's a ridge or a V trough that's in the spine of the receiver of the gun, which is actually the frame of the gun. And then there's a blade on the front of the barrel. Now, that's it. And it hit where it hit. You could kind of bend it, I guess. Or more appropriately, my uncle would tell stories that cowboys used to file the front sight gently until they would get it to where it would hit lower. So, if they needed to. But nowadays, you could definitely hunt with it. I would not recommend a Colt single action army for self-defense unless it was the last line of defense you had, because you would have to be able to empty the rounds, which in a single action army you have to open a load gate, put the gun in half cock, and turn each cylinder and kick each round out one at a time. So that's why I don't think it would make a very good self-defense gun, because you only have those 5 rounds or 6 rounds. And I say 5 because it's a single action army and the firing pin is actually attached to the hammer. On the reproductions, this firing pin has some safeties built into it that weren't originally there. Specifically, the reproductions have a spring in the firing pin that allows it to be, you have to have it at full cock for the gun to go off. So if you had it at half cock or like barely pulled the cylinder or the hammer back and let loose, it wouldn't set the round off. This was done because of federal law. There's a law on the books that happened in the 60s sometime when Ruger was making pistols that were of single action variety, and they had accidents happen, and they passed this law in Congress that says there has to be some sort of manual transfer bar that stops the firing pin from detonating a round if it was at like a quarter cock, or you barely were pulling the hammer for it to go off. That's why Alec Baldwin is in such hot water. You can't take one of these guns without pulling the trigger and having it go off. That the reason why cowboys kept 5 rounds in their cylinder, unless they were getting ready for a gunfight, is what I was always told, was to keep one cylinder dead so you could keep the firing pin or the hammer on a dead cylinder so you knew it was always safe, because you have to cock it each time you fire the gun. That's what single action means. But the metallurgy my prime example of the Colt single action army has kind of a blued barrel, but then it has this weird, different bluing on the frame, and it's kind of a rainbowy blue. Now, I've seen them really ornate where they had been engraved, and they look, one of the most expensive ones ever was a Colt single action army that Mel Torme bought, and it was from Sears and Roebuck from back in the 1800s when this gun was first coming out. In the Sears catalog, they had a drawing of this, and in the Sears store in Chicago, Illinois, they actually had one of these pistols all engraved and dressed up, and it was in the store as a display. And it was put in the basement in the 80s, and Mel Torme tracked. If you don't know who Mel Torme is, he was a jazz singer, famous jazz singer, and a renowned Colt collector. He traced that serial number down and he bought it, and it was, at the time, it was one of the most, or the most expensive handgun ever purchased at auction at Tiffany's, and it was like 1.2 million. Right after that, someone auctioned off the original. There were two Lugers made in caliber 45 that were made for Army trials. One of them was destroyed, and serial number 2 went up for auction, and then it beat that single action Army at its bid price, or its win price for its auction price. So what's interesting about this is you're seeing more and more of them actually get out in the world. You can get them, and they're not as expensive as you would think. If you get a reproduction, if you get a real Colt single action Army, you're talking $2,000 easy for a really good shape one. And that would be a cheap one that may have some wear. They are very sought out after by collectors. I don't have an example of a Colt. I should. I'm a bad gun guy for that. Just because it's a piece of American history. Officers in the military back in the day carried them. A lot of them purchased their own. Settlers would carry them. That was their self-defense. They would buy Winchester or Spencer rifles in a similar caliber so that they had the same ammunition. They weren't super high velocity rounds back then, and nowadays you have to be very careful because some of those really P++ ammunition probably shouldn't be ran through a single action Army. Not saying that they're not made out of great steel, but they were not designed, those frames weren't, and the metallurgy wasn't designed specifically for that type of pressure that they could put out nowadays. Just another iconic gun. May you have some kick-butt dreams about cowboy action shooting. Like, share, subscribe, be great.